Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this online seminar of the Illiberalism Studies Program at the George Washington University. My name is Marlène Laruelle. I'm the director of the program. And it's my great pleasure here to receive my dear colleagues, Andrea Pető, who will be discussing what I think is one of the key issues of the world, our kind of European landscape today, which is gendering illiberalism. And I think what Andrea has been trying to do that is so really important is to understand the relationship between gender and illiberalism, and arguing that gender works as the symbolic glue for a liberal state. And I think that even if we are all kind of very busy now and worried with the war in Ukraine and Russia's aggression, I think we have to keep in mind that there are this kind of gender and illiberalism aspect are still kind of very clearly interlocked, and they haven't disappeared. I mean, Orban got re-elected in Hungary, Vučić in Serbia, Marine Le Pen arrived at 42% of the voters of the elections in France last week. So we are still having a lot of kind of issues to discuss between and trying to disentangle the relationship between illiberalism and gender. Andrea Pető is an historian, a very famous one, professor at the Department of Gender Studies at the Central European University in Vienna, and also a research affiliate of the CEU Democracy Institute in Budapest, and a Doctor of Science of the Hungarian Academy of Science. She has been working on gender, politics, Holocaust. She has been widely published in international and national media. So Andrea, thank you so much for making the time for us to be here with us today, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Marlène. I would like to thank you first for the invitation and also for doing this very important lecture series, and underline that the gender ratio as far as the lecturers in this lecture series is concerned is extremely important, because usually those who are working on illiberalism and populism, they usually ignore and do not quote the work of those women whom you actually invited and created a space for them. So thank you for showing this solidarity and support. So what I would like to do today is first sharing my screen and showing you this Routledge Handbook of, somebody has to switch off the sound.
Yes. John, can you mute everybody except Andrea? Thank you.
Thank you. So this Routledge Handbook of Illiberalism, I wrote a chapter on gendering illiberalism. So I would like to present some of the key arguments here, and I would really like to hear your comments, suggestions, how to move forward, because as Marlène pointed out, these are very difficult times, and these questions will not go away without any serious intellectual work. So this is basically the structure of the talk, that you will not only see me in the whole screen, but you will have something else, and you can follow where I am at the moment, right? So yep. And I wrote this, so I will be reading this just to make sure that everything is being said, like 25-30 minutes, and then we will have like 30 minutes of discussion. So please be ready with questions, comments, and suggestions. So started in 2012, the Manipur 2, the March for All movement, has inspired hundreds of thousands of anti-same-sex marriage protesters on the streets of Paris. With the chant of "Do not touch our stereotypes," protesters employed the concept of gender in a novel way, and in so doing created a viable and desirable alternative to liberalism. In order to understand these developments, a critical investigation of already existing analytical frameworks as well as new theoretical insights are required. The concept of illiberalism originally and primarily described political developments in Latin America. Revitalized by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, famous for his nebulous rhetorical formulations, the literature on 21st century illiberal states has since proliferated. Orbán's particular formulation is a part of a political and communication strategy that exploits theoretical uncertainties regarding the concept of illiberalism to further his and his ilk's interests and agenda. The global transfer of illiberal ideas and practices have led to deep societal, political, and economic polarizations. And depending on the national context, has eliminated the checks and balances of the legal system, curtailed press and academic freedom, and captured the state by interest groups by ruthlessly exploiting the labor force, banned gendered perspectives in academia, policy, and beyond. Still, these ideas are winning more and more popular support, as Marlene pointed out in her introduction. This talk aims to analyze this complex relationship between gender and illiberalism, discussing reasons why both illiberalism and category of gender are difficult to grasp. Doing so, it engages with previous research on gender and pointing out what has been missed. Lastly, I argue that gender works as a kind of symbolic glue for illiberal states. So let's start with the relationship of gender and illiberalism. These two concepts, gender and illiberalism, have recently been connected in ways producing fundamentally new forms of relationality. And this is, just in brackets, this is another point in the literature. Is it something new, or is this just a kind of repetition of the neoconservative anti-feminism? And brackets closed. Analyzing this connection poses various challenges as illiberalism has re-emerged as a viable and electorally popular response to the 2008 triple crisis. Its modus operandi has left academics and politicians baffled ever since. The definition of populism illuminates illiberalism as, I quote, Albert Tatziel MacDonald, a sin-centered ideology which pits virtuous and homogeneous people against a set of elites and dangerous others who are together depicted and depriving or attempting to deprive the sovereign people of their rights, values, prosperity, identity, and voice, end quote. Such understanding suggests that a lack of gender perspective is constitutive to this novel phenomenon. As a sin-centered ideology, illiberalism requires a host ideology, such as neoliberalism, socialism, fascism, authoritarianism, or even totalitarianism, depending on political context, pointed out by Mudde. However, the notion of gender and relatedly gender equality also requires a host ideology. It can be attached to or nested into liberalism, neoliberalism, socialism, communism, nationalism, as well as Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. The convulsion of different host ideologies, especially within the framework of the present cultural war, makes the relationship of gender and illiberalism particularly complex. To shed a light on this complexity, I argue that the present form of illiberalism is a joint result of three aspects, and I will talk about these three aspects: the structural failures of the European neoliberal democratic project, the dark legacy of European history, and the complexities of the concept of gender. So first, the illiberal project would not have been so successful if not for its acute identification of the gendered challenges created by what Campbell called neoliberal neopatriarchy. Represented by powerful female leaders and Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, among others, the neoliberal model of women's emancipation has gained prominence across the so-called Western world in the last decades. critical feminists have pointed to the negative effects of neoliberal feminism's market orientation, overemphasis of paid employment's emancipatory aspects, simultaneous ignorance of care work, and fetish of choice and individualism at the expense of aiming for structural changes. As a result of neoliberalization, elite and upper-class women's modernity became very different from so-called ordinary women's modernity. Elite and upper-class women benefit from more access to labor market and can pay for care. For so-called ordinary women, a place in the labor market means not only facing labor segregation, but a gender gap in who performs the majority of the unpaid care work. Spoiler, women. This is another source of alienation and conflict. The elitism expressed in labeling others as backward does not help, but rather provokes critique of the elite and the so-called West. Despite the structural failures of the European neoliberal democratic project, mainstream political science scholarship still presents so-called transitional Eastern Europe uncritically. The overlooking of the structural problems of this model not only left mainstream academics and politicians unprepared for the surge of illiberalism, but also made gender as a category of analysis invisible. At the same time, feminist scholars who have been less enthusiastic about the price women paid as far as unemployment, unpaid care work, political leadership positions, a pay gap, and professional segregation were showed that gender-sensitive approach allows us to see the cracks in the so-called success story of the neoliberal model of representative democracy. It is exactly these cracks that illiberalism detects, uses to its advantage, such as the populist, welfareist, chauvinist response to the care crisis. As long as ideas about family and women and men's role in society constitute a common symbolic space of mainstream right and far-right parties, the endorsement of rhetoric based on traditionalist, complementary, and binary interpretation of gender will enable illiberal parties to appropriate key elements from right-wing party programs. Under illiberal governance, women become responsible for all unpaid care and household work, while welfare institutions are rolled back and privatized. At the same time, illiberal regimes give women recognition for their reproductive and care work. Their recognition is twofold. Symbolically, through a familialist discourse, that is about dignity and family, but via financial and social policy measures, too, such as the Family 500 Plus allowance in Poland, a benefit of 500 zloty per month for every second and next child without additional conditions, or the retirement scheme for women with 40 years of service in Hungary. By enhancing the status of care work and recognizing women's contributions to the reproduction of the society, illiberal parties seize and appropriate the discursive political space also targeted by feminist resistance towards neoliberalism. Women's political mobilization is tied to their position within the gender division of labor rather than a theoretical strategic interest. And illiberal regimes are addressing such structural inequalities and offering solutions. Their so-called demographic crisis rhetoric, for instance, has led to the state offering support to non-Roma heterosexual families with stable income welfare provisions. This process of so-called mobilization without emancipation explains that massive electoral support is achievable in different illiberal frameworks. And that also Marlene was mentioning in the in the introduction that the present Hungarian election, there was a serious gender gap, that women were voting for the Fidesz. Second, Europe was so focused on its liberal consensus that it turned a blind eye to its own dark legacy, the continuity of exclusionary and marginalizing ideologies and practices, as well as the political violence stemming therefrom. In Eastern Europe, this tradition has been successfully transmitted through family lineages, select social milieux, and subcultures, even during the oppressive communist period. But it re-emerged with vigor after 1989, and we also see, after the attack of Russia on Ukraine, that they are also using this kind of rhetoric. Third, the definition of gender itself is multi-layered. This has caused several problems, internal contradictions within the progressive emancipatory politics. Problems and contradictions that were later cunningly and ruthlessly used by illiberal forces focused on exploiting already existing cleavages. Gender is a concept, but it's also a political project, a social practice, and a theory. The concept of gender itself has been used in at least 4 different senses within the literature, as Esther Kovács pointed out. In the English-speaking context, gender became a substitute for biological sex. In this usage, gender means nothing more than men and women. However, in some fields, especially in the field of policy analysis, gender is simply a substitute for women. But gender is also an analytical category describing the social quality of distinctions based on sex, the power structures in a given society between men and women, and the roles, possibilities, and constraints attributed to those born male or female. This is how the definition of gender definition is understood in the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, the Istanbul Convention. And lastly, gender also means gender identity, a person's felt sense of identity, their disidentification vis-a-vis being born male or female. The issue is not only that the definition of gender has 4 different layers, that none of these layers nor their interrelationship as theory, practice, and project were sufficiently problematized. The way gender operates in illiberal politics remained under the radar of scholarship for long, including in recent feminist works. Certainly, with the proliferation of countries implementing illiberal policies of governance, the study of illiberalism as a political modus operandi has developed. So, gender as symbolic law. So how it developed this discussion. Gender plays an important symbolic role as one of the key tenets of illiberalism counter-hegemonic narrative. Illiberalism is an openly ideological answer to the technocratic, there is no alternative approach. It is an anti-modernist response to the modernist neoliberal model of society. As such, this is a counter-narrative and it is deeply gendered. It is centered around the concept of the traditional family and fueled by the rejection or redefinition of the key concepts, tools, and postulates of emancipatory politics, such as the universal human rights paradigm, gender mainstreaming, gender studies, equality in education, minority rights, and so on. The agenda and the discourse of illiberalism aims at the interpretative closure while simultaneously leaving room for a variety of interpretation. So that is one of the key takeaway points, this kind of elusiveness, which is a strategy as well as an intellectual challenge. In other words, illiberal politics is engaged in continuous renegotiation of the meanings of gender for the sake of its own agenda. But this is only one of the difficulties these processes represent. The other takeaway point is that the illiberalism's novel approach to gender as symbolic glue. This is the concept we worked out with Weronika Grzebelska and Eszter Kovács. Symbolic glue is a metaphor for discursive phenomena that are somehow able to tap into people's feelings of uncertainty about the world around them and direct their attention towards particular social issues. So this is also important, that the particular grounded local issues. In the liberal state, gender was quickly put to work as symbolic glue. First, illiberalism united separate contested issues and attributed them to the umbrella term of the so-called progressive agenda. Then, based on a previously constructed dynamic which perceived gender as a threatening concept, the notion of the so-called gender ideology got introduced in order to signify a failure of democratic representation. Opposition to this so-called gender ideology became a means of rejecting certain facets of the current socio-economic order, from identity politics to the human rights paradigm, with the latter described as an, I quote, empty signifier only used in political battles. It assumes a unified and homogeneous gender agenda, quote unquote, which is postulated as strong and threatening. Simultaneously, the demonization of something illiberal actors call gender ideology or theory was developing already in the Catholic circles from the 1990s, condemning the concept of gender broadly understood together with theory, practice, and a project. It is important to note that besides opposing so-called gender ideology, the political correctness illiberalism also offers a livable, viable alternative. I'm mentioning this third time because it is really important to stress, centered on the family, the nation, religious values, and freedom of speech. This package, what I termed kind of illiberal offer, is widely attractive in France, in Hungary, in other countries, because it allows for a positive identification with the individual's own choice and promises a safe and secure community as a remedy for individualism and social atomization. Illiberal forces have been able to tap into collective emotions of fear far more effectively, as well as explain the origins of ontological insecurities and offer remedies. The opposition to gender is also a possibility for the illiberal right to create a broad alliance and unite various actors that have not necessarily been eager to cooperate in the past. Thus, gender also became the symbolic glue that binds together different religious and political forces. This is why gender appears in the center of political fights that are not about gender in any of the four meanings described above, but about questioning liberal hegemony in different fields, including education and various practices of everyday life. A growing literature discusses the emergence of illiberalism under the heading of so-called anti-gender movements. Given the complexities of the concept of gender, the term anti-gender movement neither merely refers to another offshoot of centuries-old anti-feminism, nor simply to the conservative responses to the 1968-ish movement success. This anti-gender movement is a fundamentally new phenomenon, this is my position, that was launched for the sake of establishing a new world order. It is a battlefield for socialization in the Gramscian sense, of fighting for a shift in public discourse to change the perception of reality. So this kind of anti-gender movement is also a nationalist neoconservative response to the crisis of global neoliberal world order, which is why it questions the human rights paradigm and liberal democracy. As gender became politically important, gender studies as a scientific form of interdisciplinary inquiry also became a contested field. Illiberal attacks on gender studies are not only targeting the discipline, but also academic freedom. In Hungary, the anti-gender battle commenced in 2008 and ended with deleting gender studies master's program from the accredited study list in 2017. So this is gender. Let's see the gendered illiberal polypore state. So what is this new state? We worked together with Weronika Grzebalska. The newly emerging illiberal state formation operates as polypore state. So I was arguing that we have to be very careful about what gender is, what illiberalism, also how gender works, and now how the state actually works. The polypore is, when you start Googling, the polypore is a parasite pore fungus that lives on the wood and producing nothing but more polypore. The three functional characteristics of this polypore state are relevant for illiberal engendering. These are establishment of parallel institutions, state-financed NGO sphere, for example, but universities as well, excessive use of security discourse, everything is a threat, and familialism, which means that women are disappearing and certain families are becoming the centers of policy. It is on the basis of this family policy that the state's social policies exclusively support families, namely heterosexual married couples. And this kind of policy is actually extremely successful as far as gaining electoral support is concerned. Illiberalism rests on familialism, that is a form of biopolitics, which views the traditional family as a foundation of the nation and subjugates individual reproductive and self-determination rights to normative demand of the reproduction of the nation. As an illiberal response to the dominant global neoliberal demographic model, familialist policies have substituted the dedication to gender equality with their own brand of women's rights. Attack on reproductive rights followed. With migration increasing, fertility in continuous decline, and an aging population, illiberals have narrated and explained the situation in Europe as one of the demographic crises. Illiberal forces portray themselves as the only bulwark against any kind of replacement. That's the key concept in the illiberal demography policy, the great replacement, offering welfare benefits and labor competition as remedies. Relatedly, global illiberal influence and local nationalist discourse intersect in portraying Euro-Christianity that needs to be defended both from Western moral decay and Islamic aggression. This idea has become a popular discursive trope in Hungary, Poland, with both its leaders presented as the last hope for Christian Europe's civilization. And this is the discourse which needs to be reconsidered after the attack of Russia on Ukraine. The excessive use of the security discourse in the polypore state reinforces the anti-gender character of the illiberal policies. Illiberal actors regularly present policy-related questions as security questions. According to their rhetoric, they vigilantly ward off the threat posed by the European Union, the UN, the WHO, immigrants, gender studies professionals, George Soros, and so on. These characteristics of the neoliberal polypore state's modus operandi are missing or hardly present in traditional political analysis, and even less so in oppositional electoral strategies. And in the Q&A, I'm very happy to respond on questions why the opposition lost in Hungary. Partly because they did not have any kind of response to this gendered modus operandi of the illiberal state. Furthermore, the security discourse also affected the framing of science policies, naming of enemies and personal intimidation of scientists who disgrace with government policies became an everyday routine. The polypore character of the illiberal state can have detrimental consequences for emancipatory politics, because illiberalism operates through the appropriation and hijacking of previously existing mechanisms, concepts, and funding opportunities. It shrinks the discursive spaces and financial opportunities open to democratic resistance. Underfunded, marginalized, and operating in an illiberal context, deprived of checks and balances, women's NGOs, academics, and democrats are largely unable to influence governmental policymaking through existing channels of advocacy, consultation, and media pressure. The only remaining effective ways feminist actors can participate in national politics are through mass protest and grassroots organization. Only time will tell if these traditional models of mobilization will suffice to stop the building and reinforcement of this new form of governance. Illiberalism should not be perceived as a revival of authoritarianism, but rather a new form of governance resting on previous democratic concepts and institutions. It can be better understood if one goes beyond routine comparative analysis of political systems along the East-West divide, following the Cold War logic of past dependency, and instead traces the gradual socio-political developments in these countries by placing them in the context of broader global processes. Along with the issue created by the so-called neoliberal neopatriarchy, illiberalism poses some new and distinct challenges to women's movements, gender studies as an academic discipline, and emancipatory politics in general. To look at illiberalism from a critical feminist perspective is all the more pertinent, as so far scholarship has paid little or no attention to the role of gender as social relation of power, nor how women as political actors figure in the breakdown of democratic regimes and in the possible resistance to illiberal processes. When the anti-same-sex marriages on the streets of Paris, and they were a million, chanted, "Do not touch our stereotypes." Remember, this is where I started this presentation. What they demanded was their stereotypes be treated as essential forms of identification and non-negotiable moral values. As both illiberalism and gender equality need host ideologies, there is a good reason to follow developments in the field in their own right, rather than impose conventional explanatory frameworks to this emerging form of governance. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for this great element of and conceptual pieces of the discussion. I would like to open the floor for questions. You are welcome to either ask question in the chat and I will read it, or to raise your virtual hand and we will give you the floor. Andrea, if I may begin a question I have, and that's maybe because even if I'm not working on the US, I'm here based in Washington, and I wanted you to comment on the kind of transnational connection and the fact that this kind of obsession with gender or family was very much part of the culture war in the US since the 70s, right? So here it began very early in the 70s before becoming a key issue in Europe later. And so I wanted to ask you your analysis on this kind of transnational borrowing. Do you see like Europeans have been also kind of looking at what the US culture war have been producing? Also, I'm thinking about creationism as a way to enter the, the academic space. So if you could comment on that transnational borrowing aspect.
Thank you, Marlene. That's a very important question. But before I respond, may I ask you, John, to remove Jose Rodriguez, who sent me a pretty offensive message?
Yes, I think I'm sorry, we had some hackers, so I think we have removed them, all of them.
Joe Rodriguez, can you remove him? or is he already out?
He's already out.
Fantastic.
We removed, there was one or two key person.
Yeah, good, thank you. I mean, first of all, I mean, let me reflect on the Zoom bombing. I think that is a fantastic acknowledgement how important this work it is. And I would like to say that when we published with Esther Kovács and Veronika Grzebalska this work, The Gender as Symbolic Glue, in a week, the Breitbart wrote a long article and questioning whatever we wrote. And for the gender studies professionals, it took like 2-3 years to recognize how important our findings were. Just in brackets. Going back to your question about transnationalism, I think we see a very new form of transnationalism in a sense that certain very contextual cultural discussion had been moved and exported and transported to other historical and national contexts very strategically. Because of two reasons. First is that this kind of export is basically moving, taking the space away for articulating really important issues in that particular space. And secondly, because this creates a transnational movement. So if you are looking at the web page of the Citizen Go, for example, which is one of these transnational organizations, then you see that if they have a campaign in Estonia, they will have it in Indonesia or in the US or in Mexico or in Hungary in a week. It means that this is a kind of new McDonald's. So they have already the message, they have got this flashy kind of communication strategy. They are hiring and training young professionals to transmit those messages. So this is basically a transnational organization. So this kind of transnationalism is also different than the traveling concepts, because we all know this kind of traveling concepts, which is all there in the feminist and gender studies scholarship, because we only thought that good concepts are traveling, but also bad concepts are traveling. Moreover, bad concepts are being traveled around because of a political agenda. And this kind of political agenda is again to construct what I call the illiberal offer. And this illiberal offer is new in a sense that it creates a viable, livable alternative, which hasn't been the case before. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. We have a question on if you could comment on the revival of political Christianity as being one element of this kind of illiberal wave, or maybe should we look at something very, also not necessarily liberal, but as a more kind of classic revival of conservative thinking. And of course, Poland is the key country, but for France, we also have noticed this revival of political Catholicism. So how would you articulate that with this illiberal offer? Because it's also very much about gender and family.
Yeah, thank you. So if we look at political Catholicism, I would like to differentiate between the statist Christian offer, also the fundamentalist, and also the progressive and emancipatory. Because in itself, there is nothing wrong with conservatism, right? What is new here, I think, that the liberal forces are using, instrumentalizing, like the polypore, the ideas of Christianity for their own purpose. And there should be several forces who would be totally freaking out and be afraid of this particular instrumentalization of Catholicism for political purpose. First of all, the Catholic believers what they see is that their institution and their belief system basically taken over and instrumentalized by those Christian forces who are accepting blood money and very dirty money from the different governments. And these establishments are actually acting against the basic principles of Christianity. And third, they pretend that they are the fundamentalist Christians in order to eliminate any dissent voice, but not to go back really the roots of Christianity, which was an inclusive political ideology supporting the weak and the precarious. So in this sense, I would say that this is a new form of how political Christianity had been used by the institutional Christianity, by the fundamentalist Christianity. And also, just to have a sign of hope, what I see is that in these long years of struggling against illiberalism, that the best allies of the feminists turned to be the feminist theologians and those feminist and progressive actors who do not find their space in this totally polypolarized kind of Catholic context or Christian context, and therefore they are looking for new allies and new ideas, new platforms, and new alliances. And that will be actually in the long run extremely useful, because that will help to focus on the different issues instead of the focusing on who is left, who is right, who is supporting what kind of party, what kind of religious denomination that person has, and focusing on the real issue, namely how to fight against illiberalism. And there is only one way to do it, with values. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrea. We have another question. Do you see any kind of connection between the traditional anti-Semitism of the far right and the kind of anti-gender or anti-LGBT narrative? I mean, can we say that in a sense, women or LGBT communities have been replacing Jews in the kind of overarching enemy, you know, in the kind of liberal perception? Do you see some element that could be articulated like that? And in fact, they are sometimes directly articulated, but would be good to have your kind of how you would disentangle this kind of relationship.
This is a fantastic idea, and let me just try to put a podcast in the chat, because what we did, let me just finish the struggle. Yes, so here is this podcast, and with colleagues, with the support of the Open Society University Network, we had a seminar about the conversation between anti-Semitism, Holocaust, colonialism, and gender. What are the intersections as far as the cultures of hate are concerned? And this kind of conversation is, of course, extremely difficult, because each and every term had its serious baggage. In this talk, I was speaking in length about how difficult the concept gender is and how easy to misuse or use gender. But if you listen to this podcast, you will see that the purpose was for the faculty and also for the students coming from 5 universities to think about is there any connection? And basically, the students by the end of the course understood that the logic of the Enlightenment of we and them, and to create this line that who are those who are the good ones and who are those who are the bad ones, which I, in this talk, analyzed as the unfinished analysis of the dark legacy of Europe. Actually, this is a part of the same story, that how actually all these kind of hate cultures are coming from this particular European tradition, and also that the way how it works. David Feldman calls anti-Semitism as a reservoir, that you have got all these different rhetorics, pictures, legal frameworks, whatever, and it depends on the historical and cultural context. You know, politicians and anti-Semites are using and picking some useful elements from this reservoir of anti-Semitism. And if you look at how the anti-gender forces are actually picking and choosing certain elements of the anti-gender fight, namely the fight against the same-sex marriage, or the gender mainstreaming, or gender studies professionals, or you can make that list. This, you can also say that this is also a reservoir, right? And it depends on the cultural context, it depends on the political situation, who is pulling which part from this, and that for its own political purpose. And that poses a serious theoretical and methodological challenge when we are analyzing this, because it's easy to say that we in Hungary, we in Slovakia, we in US, this is what we see, right? But what we see is not necessarily there, because this is a transnational movement, right? So some of those tasks and some of those agendas are coming exported from outside. And because the hate is a reservoir, so it really depends on the particular context. If in one country the same-sex marriage becomes important, in another country the gender mainstreaming, and in another country the fight against George Soros, right? So that's why how it's really important how to take one step back as a methodological move and ask, is this really what I see? And simply, understand that not necessarily what we see is there. And because the illiberal forces are actually working on this, using this strategically, that they are creating gender as a proxy. And they are often speaking about gender, but they are not meaning gender. They are just using gender as a proxy instead of speaking about important issues. I'm sorry I was too long, but I hope I was answering the question.
Yeah, well, it's a very important question. We have another one, if you could comment on the colonialism aspect and the fact that illiberal narratives have been often articulated as an answer to what is seen as the West kind of colonial or normative pressure put on Central Europe. And so how do you think that both the EU and the kind of the civil societies should be approaching the power hierarchy that you have between Western Europe and Central Europe to try to disarm this anti-colonial, disarm the illiberalism using the anti-colonial narrative to kind of boost itself?
Right. This is actually a key question because it discusses theoretical position and also strategic positions. And as far as the theoretical position is concerned, I think it's really crucial to underline that the illiberalism can only get into the cracks which are already there, and it hasn't got any original ideas, but uses what it's already there. And basically the illiberal forces are using the already existing decolonizing narrative for their own purpose. They are instrumentalizing and using that for their own particular purpose. And with this, they again achieve two things. One, delegitimizing the decolonizing attempt. And second, that they can influence and dominate the discourse on this. And because it's really, and I pointed out in the talk, there are geopolitical differences. And if you look at how the neoliberalization of Eastern Europe used gender, for example, very often as a way of creating an imagined form of modernity, for example, there are serious issues here. And but the way how the liberals are responding to this, complaining, being the victim, which is on the one hand partly true, but if you go into this victimization narrative, that it will not really, grasp the essence of this power relations and the biopolitical realities of this particular context. So therefore, there should be a really serious reflection on the side of the feminists, I think, when we think about that different transnational organizations will bring certain policies to the so-called not that developed countries, because that would necessarily revoke an illiberal response, and only the women will lose. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that's bring me to another question we have, which is the kind of tension that we see in some part of the progressist movement between the trans question that is really the latest, the new frontier, right? And the kind of, I don't know how to name them, old-fashioned feminist, or the tension between some feminists saying that the way the trans question is discussed is in fact also deserving the feminist cause. How would you articulate that?
Oh, this is the $1 million question. So this is, something which is really important to discuss. And I would like to make a point about how we are discussing things. Because if I were an illiberal actor, I would say, the way how these debates are actually happening, because the way how it's very anti-intellectual, it's very exclusivist, instead of thinking about the common enemies. So therefore, I think that this kind of debate is a kind of interiorization of the illiberal debate culture, and also the emotional politics of this kind of illiberal. So this is the most frightening part, I have to say, that some of those who think themselves as feminists, they use exactly the same type of emotional economy to debate with peers, like the illiberals are doing. And if there is only way to fight against the illiberal attack is to somehow question this kind of economy of emotions, and move into a very different debate culture, and a different way of how emotions are articulated, because these are emotional issues, right? These are about the lives of people. So, and that necessarily brings it down to the personal level, and we know personal is political, but this should not be considered as the only way of understanding these kind of differences. Thank you.
Thank you. And we still have 5 minutes, so maybe one of the kind of the elephant in the room question, which is how much the Russia's war in Ukraine is kind of partly changing the ideological balance in Europe, and decredibilizing some illiberal leader because of their connection with Russia. And at the same time, we see, well, not for Orban, not for Vučić, not necessarily for Marine Le Pen, but how do you think that's the decoupling between being illiberal and being pro-Russian? That was the norm before. Do you think that will get decoupled now because of the war, or how do you think the geopolitical divide will overlap or not overlap with the ideological divide?
This is a fantastic question, and I'm not sure we know enough how this will change. But my kind of common sense is, and what I see in as far as the Polish-Hungarian relationship is concerned, that because of this lukewarm response from the Hungarian government, the Polish peace government very clearly drew a line. So I'm not sure that what will be and how this will change the illiberal politics, because that would assume that there is such a thing as illiberal politics. And basically, I was arguing in this whole talk that the modus operandi is the new element, and not necessarily the content and the political desire to create an alternative to liberal democracy. And they don't really care how they are doing this alternative, but they just want to get rid of this particular system of values which had been present in the global context. So this is just a hypothesis. It's not really supported by any kind of research, is that this war is like a flash in the darkness, and it makes it visible, who is what, right? And what is where. And the reality is visible. If I want to use a less sophisticated metaphor, then in the low tide, it's obvious who has got a bathing suit and who hasn't got, right? So in a sense, the war made it visible, the positionality of different politicians and political parties. And that's why it's really important to see that the peace in Poland made no compromise as far as the anti-Russian positionality is concerned. That's a non-negotiable value. And in the case of the Hungarian government, everything is negotiable, right? And I think here is the division line, that in some illiberal forces, everything is for sale, but in some cases, some are not for sale. And this kind of, in this flash in the darkness shows that, who has got some real, backbones related to politics. And that is the only way how a new world can actually build up in the future.
Thanks, Andrea. And we just got the last question, and it's an important one, so I would like to ask it also. Given that what we are discussing is very much a transnational movement, how should we interrogate illiberalism outside of the Western framework in the global South? And how do you think we have to kind of integrate also the global South perspective in our discussions?
Thank you. This is really, really important because that would require really a meaningful decolonization. And also, if you look at the work the colleagues are doing in Brazil or in Argentina or in Colombia, there are fantastic feminist scholars who are actually working on this very critically, thinking about the neoliberalization and the impact of neoliberalization, because that's the center, right? That why do we have illiberalism now? Whatever illiberalism is. And think about the three arguments I was making in this talk. And these colleagues in Latin America are, of course, that's the literature I know. I'm sorry. I'm sure there are lots of other colleagues are there in other countries, but then they are critically interrogating the implications of neoliberalization in Latin America and how it made it possible for the illiberal forces to go through the cracks and offer a solution which is really not, it's a solution for few. It is strong for the strong and weak for the weak. So I would say that this analyzing from the global South, it became much easier because of illiberalism, because the illiberalism was extremely cruel in the global South. Therefore, it made it easier for the feminist scholars to legitimize their position from there. So, I just want to radiate a glass half full position at the end of this meeting.
Great. Well, it's time for us already to conclude. So thank you so much. That was such a stimulating discussion, Andrea. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. today that is our last seminar for before the summer, but we hope to reconvene very soon with everybody. And so thank you once again, Andrea. Thank you everybody for being with us today.
Thank you.